So Terry, let's assume then that we have a one-page profile has been written around a child, including the views of the parents, the young person and the education provider. And the strategies outlined in there have been adopted, it's been shared with all the adults supporting the child, and the strategies are being implemented consistently, and yet the child's still not making really good progress, not thriving or flourishing. Well, then we'd be looking at escalating that up to the next level of SEND support, wouldn't we? But I think, first of all, it's really useful for us to talk about what do we mean by a special educational need? How is that defined?
So the Code of Practice states that a pupil has special educational needs and disability where their learning difficulty or disability calls for special educational provision. That's namely provision different from or additional to that's normally available to the whole class.
So that's interesting, isn't it? What we're talking about here is something that's provided for a child that's not normally available for other children. So what we're not talking about here is you have to have a diagnosis. And in fact, nowhere in the Code of Practice or the Children and Families Act does it say that you need a diagnosis. But the other term in there that I think is worth picking up on is that they talk about something that's normally available. So Essex, like many other local authorities, have something they call ordinarily available, don't they? Yep. Where they set out what their expectation is that should be provided to all children.
Yeah, so that would be the offer that's available to all children and young people in nursery schools and colleges. Okay, so Sue, you've just mentioned about identifying pupils that are making less than expected progress. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So according to the Code of Practice 6.17, where it outlines identifying pupils making less than expected progress, this means progress which is significantly slower than peers starting from the same baseline. Progress fails to match or better the child's previous rate of progress. Progress fails to match the gap between the child and their peers, or it widens the attainment gap. So this can include progress from other areas such as social needs, but at no point in the Code of Practice does it talk about you need any kind of a diagnosis. So here what we're talking about, as soon as we start to notice that a child is falling behind or not making the expected progress in whatever reason, for whatever reason, in whichever area, that we are thinking about, early intervention, getting in there quickly, because what we don't want is that gap widening between the child and their peers. What we want to make sure is early interventions are put in place so that a child has an equal opportunity to keep up with the learning rate of their peers. Yeah, so I've just mentioned their early interventions and, making sure that as soon as we see that progress gap widening between the child and their peers, that we want to get involved and get some supports put in place for the child. Maybe it's helpful here to identify what the Code of Practice says about what mainstream settings must provide.
So the Code of Practice 6.2 states that mainstream settings must use their best endeavours to make sure that a child with special educational needs and disabilities gets the support they need. In future, I'm going to refer to special educational needs and disabilities as SEND. Ensure children with SEND engage in activities alongside pupils who do not have SEND. Designate a teacher to be responsible for coordinating SEND provision. That would be the SENCO, which stands for Special Educational Needs Coordinator. Inform parents when they are making special educational provision for a child. Prepare a special educational needs information report with information about the support offered, facilities and how they ensure that SEND pupils are not treated less favourably. So Sue, you've mentioned about children and young people that are not making expected progress, and that's not just academic progress, is it?
No, that's right. The Code of Practice identifies 4 broad areas of need. The first area of need is communication and interaction, and in the Code of Practice 6.28 it says, children and young people with speech, language and communication needs have difficulty in communicating with others. This may be because they have difficulty saying what they want to, understanding what is being said to them, or they do not understand or use social rules of communication. The profile for every child with speech, language and communication needs is different, and their needs may change over time. They may have difficulty with one, some, or all of the different aspects of speech, language, or social communication at different times of their lives. And children with autism are likely to have particular difficulties with social interaction, and they may also experience difficulties with language, communication and imagination, which can impact on how they relate to others. The second broad area of need, according to the Code of Practice, is cognition and learning. And it says support for learning difficulties may be required when children and young people learn at a slower pace than their peers, even with appropriate differentiation. And it goes on to outline a wide range of learning difficulties that might be included, also talking about specific learning difficulties, which may affect one or more specific aspect of learning. This encompasses a range of conditions such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. The third area of need, according to the Code of Practice, is social, emotional, and mental health difficulties. And this states that children and young people may experience a wide range of social and emotional difficulties which manifest themselves in many ways. These may include becoming withdrawn or isolated, as well as displaying challenging, disruptive, or disturbing behaviour. These behaviours may reflect underlying mental health difficulties, such as anxiety or depression, eating disorders, or physical symptoms that are medically unexplained. Other children and young people may have disorders such as attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or attachment disorder. The fourth and final broad area of need is sensory and or physical needs. And it states that some children and young people require special educational provision because they have a disability which prevents or hinders them from making use of the educational facilities generally provided. These difficulties can be age-related and may fluctuate over time. Many children and young people could have vision impairment, hearing impairment, or a multisensory impairment. They will require specialist support and or equipment to access their learning or habilitation support.
Okay, Sue, so just to confirm then, it's not just children and young people that would have a learning need. We would also be looking at children that may have needs in one of those other four broad areas of needs, such as attention and listening, or sensory needs, or emotional needs.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the issues that crops up quite often for our young people is problems around anxiety, and in particular school-based anxiety. So that would come under this social, emotional, mental health needs area from the Code of Practice.
So many children and young people may only have needs within one of those areas of need. However, some children and young people may have needs within all four areas, or maybe only three areas.
Yeah, precisely. And if your child only has a need in one of those areas, they still have an entitlement to have their needs met and to have a provision made for them that meets their needs.
Okay, Sue, so we've spoken about what special educational needs means. So for a child or young person that was to have special educational needs in one or more of the four broad areas of need, and they needed special educational provision in place, so that would be namely provision that would be above that's available to the rest of the class. At that point, that's when the child should be placed on the SEND register and the graduated approach of one planning to begin.
Yeah, so in Essex, we call this cycle one planning, but other counties call it something different. I don't know, do you know some other terminologies that other areas use for this?
Yes, I think some other areas call it an individual support plan. And I think, like what you just said, it's called one planning. However, one planning is the process and the one plan is the document that's created from that process.
And not all counties call it a one plan. But for the purposes of our discussion, and we are based in Essex, we will call it the one planning process, and we'll talk about the plan that's produced as the one plan. So let's just talk now a little bit about this graduated approach to providing this SEND support for children who have, like we've just described, been identifying as not making expected progress in one or more of the areas of need, and therefore we're identifying that we need an early intervention support needs to be made for them. So we have this graduated approach, which is a cycle, isn't it?
It is. It's a four-part cycle of assess, plan, do and review.
So let's try and break that down. So the first stage is assess the child. So here the class teacher, supported and assisted by the SENCO, would be gathering information about the child, looking at their progress data. They would be comparing that with national data, but they would also be collecting a range of other bits of information about the child, of course, depending on what broad area of need their difficulties fell under.
Yeah, so they may be gathering information at that point from parents and from the child and young person themselves, and also from other professionals such as paediatricians, speech and language, social care.
So during this assess phase, the schools should be taking any concerns that the parents has, they should be taking that seriously, putting together all this information, and then the idea is that the next stage of the cycle will be to produce a plan.
Absolutely. So as you said, the next stage is plan. So that is when the class teacher, working in collaboration with the SENCO, taking all that information from parents and carers and young people and children and any other professionals, and they plan what interventions and support needs to be in place. It's really important at this stage that parents are informed of any special educational provision that's going to be made for their child.
Yeah, so we'll come back to talk about what the plan should actually look like in a minute. But once, let's just assume the plan has been put together and it's in place, and the next phase is then to do the plan, to implement the plan.
Absolutely. So that's when all of the provision will be put into place, the strategies, and there should be a clear identification of who's going to be responsible for carrying those out, when and how long for.
So once the plan has been implemented, the Code of Practice then says it must be reviewed. In the Code of Practice, it says that the plan should be reviewed 3 times a year, so good practice would be termly.
Yep, absolutely. So good practice would be termly, but sometimes there'll be a need to review that plan sooner than termly. And some of those examples could be when a child's at high risk of exclusion. So then we would expect maybe one planning to be for it to be reviewed every half term rather than, and they're just examples, rather than every term. But good practice would be at least 3 times a year. Also, during the review stage, it's really important that parents and carers and the young person are a part of that.
Yeah, so I think this is a point really worth emphasising, that it's not supposed to be the case that the education provider writes a review of what the plan is, rewrites a new one, and then gives it to the parent and says, here's what the new plan looks like. This review cycle is a really important part of the process, isn't it? And it's supposed to be a 3-way conversation, isn't it, between the education provider, the child or young person, and the parents and carers. It's supposed to be a conversation that happens to review how has the plan been implemented, has it achieved the outcomes that were set out, if not, why not, and then to think about what should the next steps be.
Absolutely. So like you just said, at the review stage, it should be around what's working, what's not working, and don't be afraid to discuss what's not working as well, because then that will form the next part of the plan when we come to do the assess part again. I think, but at this stage, it's really important to note as well that with the review stage, that this shouldn't just be tagged on in a quick 5-minute meeting. Parents and carers and young people and children should be given the time they need to be able to say what they think is working and what isn't, and review that plan properly with the class teacher or the SENCO.
Yeah, so this is a meeting that is over and above what parents would be offered as a regular parents' evening appointment that's offered to all parents. It should be over and above like the end of year reports that every child gets, where you have like a meet the teacher at the end of the year. This should be a separate meeting where good time is allocated to review that child's education provision.
Absolutely, and parents should be aware of that, so they shouldn't just be handed a one-plan document and saying that we've reviewed that for you. They should be a part of that process.
One of the things I always recommend to parents is to think of themselves as a child's project manager, so that instead of waiting for the school to provide them with a plan and tell them what's happening, for them to kind of make sure that they keep an eye on when are the dates that the plan should be reviewed. If they haven't heard, getting in touch with the school, and then making sure that when they go to the meeting that they're going forward with some clear ideas about, well, we think this worked, we think this didn't work quite so well, here's what we think could be included next time, or here's how we think those targets could be broken down smaller for our child.
Okay, so let's come back to the actual plan. So I think it's really worth saying at this point that every school has a different format of the one plan document. So, what one school might use as a one plan document, another school won't. I know that you have your own one plan document that you use and you share with parents.
Yeah, so let me talk through that a little bit. I know that I've seen many plans that are set out in this structure of assess, plan, do, review. And there's nothing terribly wrong with that, but that describes the process of one planning. It doesn't necessarily mean that that should be the headings. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I think that the plan that I have is just more focused, more specific, and also I'm thinking about every teacher that then has to look at this plan and keep that information in their head and implement it. So the format that I've got, I think, is concise enough to make sense to the young person and their parents, and also to be a useful tool for the teacher to remember and hold in mind the interventions that are useful for that child. Here's the plan that I have put together, and it's divided up into these several columns and headings. And the first column here, outcomes, identifies long-term outcomes. Now, according to the Code of Practice, a long-term outcome relates to the end of the current phase of education. So if a plan were written for a young person in year 7, the end of that phase of education would be at the end of Key Stage 3, so that would be as they go into year 9. So for this young person, the long-term outcome would be to develop social communication skills so he can interact effectively with peers and adults. So obviously that's not something that we're going to expect the young person to be able to achieve within one term. But the next column, next steps, means this term. What do we think the young person would be able to achieve within this term, working towards that long-term goal? And here we've written to learn a key phrase to use with a quiet voice to express a difference of opinion to a peer. So the next column along just describes, well, where are they now with this area? And here we're saying, well, he's aware of a difference of opinion, but becomes increasingly agitated if the other party does not agree with his perspective. So then we're going to talk about the intervention and strategies that are going to be used. So here we have use of a social story called How to Disagree, and we're going to practice the key phrases from this. So there is a social story that goes along with this, and let me just read that for you. So here's the strategy from this one plan, How to Manage a Disagreement. So this is a social story that I have written for this fictional young person, and it goes like this. People can often have a different opinion to each other. When people talk to each other and have a different opinion to each other, they disagree. This is okay. When I disagree with a friend, I usually feel disappointed or uncomfortable. Sometimes the friend may notice, and sometimes they might be unaware that we disagree. At school, it's usually the adult's job to help children manage disagreements. The adults usually do this quietly or in private. Sometimes a child might notice that they disagree with someone. They might want to tell the person that they disagree. It's important to be careful of the other person's feelings while highlighting or helping with a disagreement. Speaking quietly so others cannot hear, and also using words that are helpful and kind, is a friendly and respectful thing to do. If I disagree with someone, I'll try to speak to them quietly and choose helpful and positive words. One way of doing this is saying in a quiet voice, I think we'll have to agree to disagree about this. Sometimes the other person will agree to disagree. Sometimes the other person might want to talk about the issue they disagree on, and sometimes the other person might not want to talk about the disagreement. This is all okay. All people disagree sometimes. People can disagree about many things but still be good friends and act in a friendly manner towards each other. So that identifies the strategy that's going to be used here for this young person, and this practice of key phrase is going to be, I think we'll have to agree to disagree. So in the next column on the plan here, it then identifies how often is this strategy going to be implemented and who's going to do it. So here it says this is going to happen once a week for 15 minutes in discussion with the learning support assistant. And then the final column, the review column, that's left blank, and that should be completed together as a conversation at the review meeting.
Okay, so Sue, you mentioned the review stage. So am I right in thinking that the long-term outcomes and the short-term next steps, they shouldn't just be carried over every term and every key stage?
Yeah, exactly. Now, I would say this is something I see very often in the plans that I see, that in some form, the goal or the outcome is just rolled over, continued. The wording might be tweaked slightly, but it's clear the young person hasn't actually achieved that goal. And usually that is because the goal has been set too broadly. It hasn't been specific enough. So where I've identified here a long-term outcome to develop social communication skills to interact effectively, sometimes I see that as a short-term goal. And actually what I would say is an awful lot of adults that still haven't achieved the ability to do that. So expecting a young person with additional needs to do that within a term is a big ask. So it just needs to always be broken down into those small steps. So my advice would always be that if for a parent having a review meeting and seeing these targets rolled over time after time, go away and have a go yourself at thinking about how could they be broken down smaller. And I think in the experiences that I hear from parents, hundreds and thousands of parents that I've spoken to, where young people and children are not thriving, not making progress, not enjoying going to school, it's often because the level of support identified via one planning has not been specific enough. So actually what we have is young people's needs not being met because the plan has not been detailed enough.
So it's really clear that that review stage is really important to look at what's working, what's not working, and if it's not working, what needs changing? Does the provision need changing? Do the short-term next steps need changing?
It definitely, and this is why it's a really good idea for a parent to always go to that meeting prepared. Have looked at the plan, have thought about it, go along with the parent's own ideas about what works at home, so that you're going in with a clear ask for that meeting. So you're not just waiting to hear what the professionals say, but you're coming along with your own equally important contribution to make to that review process.
Okay, Sue, so the plan might include academic targets. So can I just confirm that it's really important that it's not just academic targets? So we go back to looking at those 4 broad areas of need. Some young people may have difficulties socially, emotionally, with sensory processing. And for those difficulties, whether diagnosed or undiagnosed, if the child is presenting with that difficulty, they should also be included in the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And unless the child has a specific learning difficulty, such as dyslexia or dyscalculia, I wouldn't actually expect to see academic targets on a plan. Usually young people and children are dropping behind with their learning because of all of the other broad areas of need that we've gone through from the Code of Practice. So it might be that they have problems with attention and listening, or processing the language content, or the social context, or maybe emotionally and mental health issues that are barriers to their learning, and that's the reason why they're dropping behind. So I think it's really important to have a look at, does the child have a specific learning difficulty, in which case of course you would expect to see outcomes and strategies identified to help them with that. But if that's actually not what the primary problem is for the child, then actually you wouldn't expect to see that. You'd expect those issues around learning and the curriculum to be addressed through teaching, high quality teaching that's differentiated for each pupil. And the supports identified in the One Plan should basically be what enables the child then to access the learning environment on the level playing field with all other young people. One of the analogies I often use is to say that, if I'm sitting in a classroom and the work is on the board at the front of the class, all of the children in the class have equal access to that information. Apart from me, I can't see it because my eyes are not very good. So the support that I need to access those learning materials is I need glasses. I don't need to spend more time reading. I don't need to have an intervention about listening, because my problem is that my eyes can't see the work. So if I'm just given that, then I have equal access. So it's the same principle with our young people. So if you have a young person with ADHD, their problems are going to be around attention and listening, that they can't process an instruction that's given to the whole class, for example, that they need that information broken down much more, that they can't stay on task for a long time without moving about. So in order to be able to make progress, that child just needs support around that particular difficulty.
So just to confirm then, Sue, so lots of children and young people's needs can be met through ordinary available. That is the provision that will be available to all of the class. However, if your child or young person has a learning difficulty or disability that requires special educational provision that's namely above that, that's available to the rest of the class, that's when you would look at the graduated approach of One Plan to begin, and your child would then be being placed on the SEND register with a One Plan being devised, put into place.
Yeah, exactly. And many parents who I work with, when I say, is your child receiving SEND support, don't know. So they don't know whether the child has a one-page profile or if their child has a One Plan. And sometimes parents will say, I did see a plan about a year ago. So my advice is always, if you don't know and you're not sure, ask the school. Ask if your child is on the SEND register and ask what level of support they're receiving. And you should ask for copies of all paperwork, any plans that have been put in place for your child. You should be involved in that process all the way through.
And just to confirm, a one-page profile is not a One Plan document. So a one-page profile is, as we explained in previously, that is all of the information written in the voice of the child on one sheet of paper, normally in 3 headings with a photo of the child. However, a One Plan, which is the document, is part of the process of One Planning, and that would come if your child has special educational needs, which requires provision in place above that that's available for the rest of the class.
Yeah, and the difference between a one-page profile and a One Plan is you don't have 3 times a year review of that one-page profile. That's not identified in the Code of Practice at all. Obviously, as a parent, you'll want to keep your eye on that and make sure that you and your young person are happy that it's an accurate reflection of where they currently are at and the kind of current difficulties or support that they need. But a One Plan very clearly has to be reviewed 3 times a year. So it's much more measurable in that way. But again, moving from a one-page profile to a One Plan is hopefully something that will be a conversation with the child, the parent and the school as to the need of the child and the level of provision that's needed.
And a one-page profile can stand alone on its own, be a part of the one planning document or the one planning process and the one plan, and a part of the education, health and care plan.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make, that this graduated approach doesn't mean that as you move up to the next level, the previous level disappears. So you can have a one-page profile, your graduated approach can be escalated up to one planning, and then if you're then going on to talk about an education, health and care plan, you still would keep a one plan and you would still keep the one-page profile, so that you have this really well-rounded picture of the young person, including their voice, so that everybody understands a specific provision that needs to be made for them. So in conclusion, Terry, just to reinforce this point that there is no standard template for a one plan. Everybody seems to use their own version. And there's a lot of information for parents to consider in all this, but there are some helpful places to get more information and support, aren't there?
As you said, Sue, you've got your own template of what a one plan should look like. There's also good resources on our website, on Families in Focus, on SendIAS and on the local offer.
Yeah, and on the local offer, one of the things that they do have is a one plan checklist, which can be a helpful guide for parents who are going forward to their one plan review meeting, with just a table of things to think about and what should be included on the plan.